My wife and the two children were way over there underneath that rather terrifying thundercloud. And we saw it while we were fishing and decided we should get back home. It could be, out of a cloud like that, oftentimes you would see a tornado come about. So we get in the car and we're going back towards Greensboro, Alabama. And the sun was shining here. And I said, Daddy, just let me get out and make a quick snapshot of that corn sign. And I made 3 different looks with the little brownie. And I said, who runs that country store, Daddy? He said, oh, that's Mr. So-and-so. We went to high school together. So 2 weeks later, I had the actual sign, tied it on the top of our Volkswagen Squareback, and looked like something out of the Grapes of Wrath, and drove all the way back to Washington. But it had become something like an icon. And the fact that it was looming out there, and it had a lot to do with that brooding sky, I'll grant you, there was once a sign down below at the base of the corn cob about so big, and it said Pioneer Hybrid. And that was the evidence to me that what it was an advertisement for a hybrid corn seed. Some of you, especially from the Midwest, have heard of DeKalb, which is also in the shape of a corn cob with wings. So some of these people who design these things have quite an interesting sense of humor. Several years after that, after this story, my first book, called William Christenberry's Southern Photographs, was about to go to press in New York. And we had selected this picture to be on the cover, the dust jacket, reproduced 3 by 5 inches on a black field. And I thought everything was in good shape. About 2 days before the presses are to start to run, the publisher in New York, who by nature was a rather gruff, strongly opinionated man who didn't mind expressing his opinion. Now, he had been a part of the understanding that this was going to be on the cover, but he called me and he said, Bill, I need to talk to you about something. I said, well, what's the problem, Michael? He said, you know the picture corn sign with storm cloud we've all selected for the cover of your book? I said, yes, I do. He said, well, he just couldn't. It's just very difficult for him to say what he had to say. He said, we're having second thoughts about that now. I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, we're just having some second thoughts as to whether that should be on the cover of the book. And I said, well, just tell me, why? I thought we agreed on this. We did, but we're having second thoughts. I said, well, can you please tell me? Long pause. We just come to the conclusion it's awfully phallic. And remember, that's 1983. That's not in the early 90s with the Mapplethorpe issue institution that I care so much about, the Corcoran. I think that's one reason that book sold as well as it did. I stood my ground. I just remained firm, and it's a collector's item now, just because of that sign. I don't know about that. But isn't it a powerful image out in that landscape? And if you visit my studio, you'll see that sucker hanging right up there on a big wall, 8 feet tall. That's something of a light story, or I hope a little bit of humor there. There's another side to my work. It's not easy to talk about. It's a lot easier to talk about the humorous or the lighthearted. So the tragic and the comic enter into this somehow. I was photographing a country store just up the way from this little flat-topped house. And no one was around that day. It was most unusual. It was very quiet. And at this time, I'm using an 8x10 view camera, a camera that you have to put a dark cloth over your head, and you get down there and you finally see the image in the ground glass, and the image is upside down. But you overcome that. So here I am thinking I'm alone, and I finish the focus, and I come out take the dark cloth off my head, and poof, just like that, there was a man this close, within arm's reach. I did not hear any footsteps. It did startle me. It did startle me. Beautiful purple-black skin, as you see so often in the Deep South. White starched shirt, white starched pants, recently polished white shoes, and a big wide-brimmed white hat. And he said, you like that old building, son? Now, most people would say, why do you like that? But he said, do you like that old building, son? I said, yes, sir. You ought to see my house. I said, well, sir, when I finish here, I'd like to see your house. And that was really more out of courtesy than anything else. I had no idea what I would see. So he waited a few more minutes, and then I broke down the tripod and the camera and put it in the back of the car. And he got in beside me, and he said, just down that road a couple of miles. And I started down the road, and then he said to me, do you know where I can get any work, son? I lost this left arm, and his arm was missing from the short sleeve shirt down. You know where I can get any work? I lost this arm in a sawmill accident, 1940-something. I haven't been able to get a decent job since then. I tell you all, that question will stay with me the rest of my life, because I knew I had no sensible, reasonable response. I didn't know what to say or do. I was so affected, so moved by this. And all I could think to say was, sir, my family doesn't live here anymore, and I just don't know of any jobs. And by that time, he said, pull over the shoulder of the road, right there. And he pointed out the car window towards that house, and he said, I built that house with one arm. And I said, well, that's wonderful. He said, let me show you inside. So we go down this side road here, a little red earth road, and we go in the back door, and my heart really sank because there was no floor. It was just red earth, a broken up old mattress over there, the dilapidated chair. And we chatted a few minutes, and I said, sir, do you mind if I photograph your house? Oh, I would be thrilled for you to do that. So I set up the big camera, and I made this exposure. And of course I thanked him, and I left. Well, a week or so later, I see the result of the reprint here in Washington after it had been processed at the lab. And technically, it's fine. It's in focus, decently composed, but it didn't resonate at all with anything pertaining to that event. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't know how one could capture that anyway, except the poet, the one creative individual that I most admire. So I said, well, I missed it, didn't get it, I'll go back next year, because I go back same places year after year. A year later, I pulled on the same shoulder of the road, got out of my car, start down that road, that little road there, to knock on the door. And I only got a few feet down the road, and then a gentleman comes across his lawn over here to the right, and he comes up and he grabs the top of his fence and he looks at me and he points to the house. You looking for Mr. So-and-so? I said, yes, sir. He died. He froze to death last winter. And you know, I go back to that every year, and I've still not aimed a camera lens at it. Beautiful little piece of vernacular architecture called Building with False Brick Siding. It's that asphalt shingle that comes in rolls, and you can just roll it or tack it or staple it up there. You see it often in red, in this case the ochre color. Look at the proportion of that. Isn't that a beautiful little Greek temple? And then that column, that one column, the others had been broken off or something, and that's not kudzu. You'll see kudzu later tonight, about 11:30. And that's a Virginia creeper creeping up that column. So here it is in 74. Here it is in 84. Here it is in 91, springtime. I happened to be there in the springtime. The vine had not started its growth period. And here it is, 20 years later, 1994. Mr. T.B. Hicks's store in 1976, and I never have difficulty remembering the date on this one because of that red, white, and blue trash can. 76, 81, 91, and then the next year it was gone. I mentioned earlier of using the subject matter in painting. Then I began to have this desire to see if I could carry the subject matter over into the third dimension, into my sculpture. I photographed this beautiful little country church in a community or near a community called Sprott, Alabama, S-P-R-O-T-T. It was Christmas, 1971, when my wife and then 2 children drove from Washington to visit family in Alabama, and we stopped by here because the light was just right, and I made this snapshot. Well, that's one reason the sky is so blue, because you have a less humidity in winter, of course. And when I got the picture processed back in Washington, it began to just literally haunt me in the best sense of that word, haunt. I just didn't know what it was saying to me. Then I had the idea of, why don't you try to make a sculpture related to this? And one night, a dear friend of mine named Walter Hopps was at the studio, and he too loved this little picture. And I said, Walter, I can't possess Sprott Church. I can't bring the real church back to Washington. I've made photographs of it. I've made drawings of it. Nothing seems to suffice. I have this desire to make a small version. Now, I did not say model. But I've never done anything like that. And Walter looked me in the eye and he said, you'll never know till you try it, will you? I'll never forget the look in his eye. So that gauntlet, I then almost had to do it. So I went to work. I had this view with the brownie, I had a side view with the brownie, and I had a thumbnail sketch in my sketchbook of the rear of the church. And this is the end result. It took me 1 year to figure it out. When I was a kid, no good at model airplanes. I'd get so far into a model airplane, I'd take it up to the second floor of my parents' house, set the tail on fire, and throw it out the window and watch it crash. No patience whatsoever. Now people look at these pieces and say, you must have the patience of Job. No, I'm just crazy. Painting it, surprisingly, was almost as complicated as building it. Facade about this wide, about this high, and about this deep. You will see it at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It belongs to the Menil Museum in Houston, Texas, and they're kind enough to let us borrow it. Then how am I going to present this? And I mean, even in those days, how am I going to exhibit this when there is an exhibition? And I got the idea of bringing back some real Alabama red earth. A lot of people use the word dirt. That'll come into play here in a minute. So there's about 200 pounds of it that I sifted through a window screen sifter to get the pine needles and pebbles and out of. And this is a beautiful scale. It's a feel to it. It's almost like brown sugar. And I was asked by by my father one time to give a small slide presentation at the annual Christenberry reunion. And I mentioned this piece, and I used the word dirt. And one of my uncles, who is a retired agronomist from Auburn University, came up after the talk, it wasn't a lecture, and he called me William, which was fine. He said, William, I really enjoyed this, I enjoyed seeing what you've been doing with yourself over all these years. But you don't call it dirt, son. You don't call it dirt. It's soil. And he gestured like this. Soil nurtures life. I have a difficult time saying that word as a Southerner. It doesn't come out right. Soil. Soil, like S-O-Y-L. I had an exhibition in Houston. I had packed up the red earth for the movers. I had written on the side of the box, red soil, S-O-I-L. I get to Houston. We had loaded the truck, and a week later I'm in Houston. They had marked through S-O-I-L and with a big magic mark and wrote S-O-Y-L, soil. So here is the Sprott Church at the Corcoran in 1983, and way over in the far corner is another piece called Abandoned House. It's been something of a struggle. It certainly was a number of years ago when critics and writers or writers on art would, as one New York writer said, there's no way he could see these as sculpture. That's gotten better over the years. I call them building constructions. And here is the Palmist building at the Corcoran and the actual sign over to the left that's worth $1 million. Corley's Rebel Gasoline Station, a beautiful little piece of vernacular architecture. This picture was made in 1964, and there may be a few of you in the audience that remember those old hand pumps where you pump the gasoline. And then in the early 80s, the sculpture of Corley's Rebel Gasoline Station. This sculpture, or a reproduction of it, and other things appeared. We had a request from Metropolitan Home magazine a number of years ago out of New York. They wanted to do an article on our house and my studio. My advice to you, if you ever have an offer like that, say no. They all were nice people and good intentions, but they swooped down with Perrier and sunflowers and all sorts of things and redo your house. And they were there from 9 in the morning till 10:30 that night. And then several weeks later, the article comes out, which was a nice article. I'm not complaining, really. And a few weeks go by, and one day, late in the afternoon, the phone rang. I'm going to see if I can imitate this guy's voice. "Is this William Christenberry?" I said, "Yes, sir." "This is Willard Corley. I'm calling you from Cottondale, Alabama. I understand you made a model." I had to bite my tongue, you may bite the bullet. "A model of my father's gasoline station." I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Corley. I did in 1983. He said, "I'd really like to talk to you about making me one of those." "What would it cost me, Mr. Christenberry?" I didn't know how to respond to that because I didn't want to embarrass him. I certainly didn't want to embarrass myself, and I was having to think as fast as I could, which is not too fast. I opted for the truth. I said, "Mr. Corley, those pieces," remember this is 83, "those pieces range from $25,000 to $35,000 each." Long pause. I thought I'd lost him. Just long pause. Then he came back on. He said, "Awfully nice talking to you, Mr. Christenberry." And I haven't heard from him since. And here it is, manifest itself again in Absolute Christenberry. Absolute contacted me several years ago and asked me if I would, let me make it clear up front, this did not appear in every magazine in the country. This was for a special benefit. I think it was an AIDS benefit in New York, and they asked a number of visual artists to do this. And, Lord, I said, well, I'm flattered to be asked, but I didn't tell them I had no idea. I said, "Oh, think about it." So what I did was, this is a photograph of the sculpture, and I carved this pump out here, which is about as difficult to make as it was the sculpture, and set it on a field of red earth. And then I painted an Absolute vodka bottle as if it were weathered, like a weathered sign. And I took it to Ginkgo's because it's a scale that's about this high, maybe 2.5 inches high. And I made it larger because it was so tedious and small and I took it to Ginkgo's. I just kept reducing it to the scale here, and I glued it to the front of the door, as you see, and I sent it off to New York, and they went berserk with enthusiasm. "Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, we're so pleased that we asked you." I felt great. And then they said, "But we have to ask you to do one thing." I said, "What's that?" "Would you mask out the 2 Pepsi-Cola signs?" See to the left and right of the door? Pepsi. So I just took a little white gesso and slightly opaqued out the word Pepsi. Now, all of us recognized that Pepsi sign, and they were just ecstatic over it. Didn't send me any free vodka, though. This is called Horses in Black Buildings. This is 1978, and I was still learning about that big camera. And my lens is over. I didn't know the landowner at the time. And I tell you, you're highly suspect out in the country, pretty much anywhere, when you have cameras. You know, they don't know, what are you? Of course, when I have to, I can speak the language pretty well down there. But so the lens is over the barbed wire fence. I'm behind, and those 3 horses were just racing across that pasture as I set up the camera, just having the best time, almost showing off for me. And I forgot about them, which meant that if they had been moving, it had been a blur. But when I got the picture back, the proof print, those horses stood for their portrait. And if you look at them, they stood in a triangular configuration, just like the roof line of those buildings. Horses in Black Buildings. The sculpture, Horses in Black Buildings. I've got to tell this story. We'll be out of here by midnight, I promise. The landowner, let's go back to it. The landowner has known my family for a long, long time. And he's a well-educated man. He was. He's since passed away. And he became very interested in my work, what he could know of it through books and whatever, and supportive. Whereas a lot of people just think, wow, why does he do this? Speaking of me, what does he do? Does he sell these things? What is it about? And it's almost impossible to make it clear why I care about these things. But anyway, this was made into a beautiful postcard, a big postcard by a museum, about this big. Got a lot of national exposure. And I was up at Ohio State University giving a slide talk, and I showed this picture, and at the question and commentary period afterwards, a young man stood up in the back and he said, "Well, if it's as hot as you say it is, or here it is down there, why did they paint those buildings black?" And I said, "Young man, I wish I could tell you, I don't know. I just don't know." A very legitimate question. A few weeks later, I'm in Alabama, and I see the gentleman, Mr. Walthall. We're standing on the steps of his country store looking out at pretty much what you see here. And I knew it was risky, but I had to ask. I said, "Mr. Walthall, in my travels, a lot of people ask me, why are those buildings painted black?" And I thought he was going to get angry because his whole demeanor, everything changed. And he looked down at the floor of the porch, and he sort of pawed it, and he looked up at me and he said, "Well, son, I'll tell you, those old buildings were rusting pretty badly, and we had a lot of black paint around." Now, come on, it's better than that. You don't like that story? That's so typical of people in the country, and I don't mean that in a demeaning way. Just a matter of fact, we had a lot of black paint around. Okay, we saw that. A picture that's very meaningful to me is a picture I made on that Christmas trip, 1971. I excused myself from my parents' house and went on the outskirts of this little town where they were living at the time. And here was this, literally a shack. Smoke was coming out of the chimney. Remember, this is December. I knocked on this door. I thought I should ask permission, although I didn't see anyone. This old lady comes to the door, and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you mind if I photograph your house?" "Oh, I don't mind. I'd be honored for you to photograph my house." So I stepped back, and in a minute she came back to the door and she said, "Wait a minute, mister, wait a minute. Let me turn my Christmas lights on for you." And it's one of the most moving and poignant things that have ever happened to me, because this was probably the only Christmas she had. That child's drawing of Santa Claus there on brown paper and that little string of lights. And here it is the following summer, July, and the door to our right would have been where the Christmas lights were. And that's where they could paint only as high as they could reach. And I went back every year until 76, and then the house was gone, and there was absolutely no remnant, no pieces of wood, nothing, like it never existed. And here is my sculpture of it. It belongs to the Kemper Museum in Kansas City. The Barbecue Inn. Every community has its Dewdrop Inn or its Barbecue Inn. One of the best examples of brick vernacular architecture that I've experienced, especially in my part of the South. And here's the sculpture of it. The first and only brick building I ever made. I ain't gonna build no more. Just about killed me. It now belongs to the Yale Art Gallery in New Haven. And here it is, excuse me, on exhibit with the related photographs, both photographs of the real Barbecue Inn, both large format and brownie snapshots. This will be certainly a part of the exhibition at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And I hope all of you get to see it, because this is not something I actually made. This was made by my grandfather, Christenberry. In the late years of his life, he was bedridden with asthma and a heart condition. Beside his bed on a wall, he kept this old calendar, cheap newsprint calendar. And he would write in important dates in the history of the family, pencil it in, which is not uncommon. A lot of people do that in their Bible or some other source. But Grandpa Christenberry did this, and I just thought it was one of the most wonderful and moving things that I'd seen, and I was concerned about its longevity. And he had left it to one of his daughters, one of my aunts, had a wonderful name, Aunt Sister. And in 1973, I asked Aunt Sister if I could be considered to inherit this someday. And she said, "I can't think of anybody better in the family to have it than you, because I know you'll take care of it." And it's the most fascinating reading. The first dove coo of a given spring, when he bought his first pickup truck, and of course, when relatives died. And then on September the 5th, 1951, Grandpa died, and my father penciled in the death of his father. And then 3 years ago, I had to do it for my father, and more recently with my mother's passing. And it will always be in the family. And then when I decided to display it or put it up this way, it has become a source of a lot of interest, people, especially people that take the time to read it. And that's one of his walking canes in the center. And right above it, in a small frame, is a receipt for taxes paid that I found in his change purse after his death for $29 and some few cents. So it's called Calendar Wall for D.K. Christenberry. Red building in forest. Another beautiful example of vernacular architecture, and I like the fact that that door looks like brick. Of course, that's the shingle that looks like brick. I call this my Magritte building, for you all that know the work of the great surrealist from Belgium, René Magritte, how he played these illusions of space. And I go back to it every year. I was there a couple of weeks ago and made my annual photograph of it. It was once a country schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse, and just sits there in this pine forest now. And there's the little sculpture. And I think it opens next week or sometime soon in an exhibition and related photographs of the actual building at the Getty. And this now belongs to the Getty. This is not based on something real, but it's called China Grove Memory, a childhood memory. And right inside the door of that house is a 6-inch long coffin, China Grove Memory. The vine that devours the South, kudzu, brought here from Japan at the turn of the 20th century. Agronomists thought it would prevent soil erosion. It did more than that. It devours the American South. It'll grow 1.5 feet in 24 hours. It'll put roots 20 feet into the earth to find water in the dry season. It is something to behold. Yet to me, when it chokes, I'm sorry to see it choke these trees to death, but it can make the most beautiful kind of topiaries. And I've been fascinated with it both summer and winter all of my life. I'm scared of it. I won't get too close to it because I was always told there were terrible snakes and scorpions and dragons that lived in it. So I'm always at road edge when I photograph this. The gourd tree, the Martin house. The gourd tree or Martin house is prevalent to this day in the Deep South and as far north as Pennsylvania. Farmers especially will string up dried gourds, cut a hole about the size of $0.50, no larger, no smaller, because if it's not that size, it'll attract unwanted birds. And they hope that this beautiful purple-black bird called the purple martin will come make its nest there in March, in the spring. And the purple martin flies all the way from Central and South America to this region and beyond in March. Now, I've always been fascinated by these long before I saw Mr. Alexander Calder's stay builds and mobiles. It's just the most natural kind of mobile. Of course, it's been said that Christenberry's out of his gourd anyway. I can't respond to that. This was on my uncle's farm, and I just think in terms of volume and line and all of this is just an exquisite thing. So I've made many photographs over the years of gourd trees and wondering where did this originate? Where did this come from? And I discovered just about 10 years ago it was started, this tradition of stringing up dried gourds, by the American Indian in the Southeast as a mosquito deterrent. So if you learn nothing else tonight, now you know what gourd tree is. Sorry that slide is a little dark, but this is the green warehouse. This beautiful, as far as I know, it was just a shed that I go back to every year, and the people keep it up because they know I'm coming back next year. And here's the sculpture, and this too will be at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And related photographs. There's the sculpture, and all of these years from 1973, top left, to 2005, almost every year, you'll have the photograph almost always from the same vantage point. So this thing of serial imagery, or the relationship, this accumulation of things, has become quite an important part of my work. Sadly, so many of these things are disappearing, these subjects. And then there are those pieces that are more abstract, that I call southern monuments, things that one might have dreamed that they saw in the landscape. They almost always involve a sphere, a ladder. I've always loved Murrow's ladder reaching towards the moon, and of course how Miss O'Keeffe, George O'Keeffe, used the ladder in many ways. They're meant to be more evocative, not unlike aspects of vernacular architecture of the past. And then 32 top snuff signs. Top snuff was a prevalent form of outdoor advertising. I don't partake of snuff, but nevertheless the signage was always interesting. The top left would be 1971 all the way down to 1975. 32, remember that. And it's a little tongue-in-cheek play on Mr. Warhol's 32 Campbell soup cans. And then, fairly early on, I started making wall constructions, cutting up some of the found signs that I didn't mind sacrificing, and some paint. This belongs to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, called Alabama Wall. The Alabama box. This is a multiple. This is a beautifully crafted pine box, so big. In the drawer are 2 different size photographs, all beautifully mounted. And this is an edition of 20 with 5 artist proofs. And I contacted or found the people that make top snuff signs in Massillon, Ohio, and they'd made me 25 little top snuff signs so I didn't have to sacrifice my originals. In more recent years, certainly as I get older, this element of memory begins to permeate the work. This is a memory form, and there are basic architectural type forms and almost always covered with white wax, suggesting to me memory. And I always think of Miss Dickinson and a wonderful line from a letter to one of her sister. Memory is a strange bell, both jubilee and knell. I'm going to make this brief because we don't want to take up all night here, but I cannot talk about my work or make an attempt at it without referencing the dark side again. And this is the Klan, and we're going to make this brief. Being a Southerner and caring a great deal about where I'm from, having such close ties with it, how could anyone not look at this some way? I couldn't believe, and this was in the early 60s when I still lived there, and when I went to Memphis in 62, that no artist that I knew in any form was referencing this. And I'm the first to admit that dealing with such subject matter is risky business, and difficult to bring off. Picasso did it with Guernica. Goya did it in so much of his work. 2 major figures for me, those 2 artists. So here was a 1961, beside the road as you entered my hometown of Tuscaloosa, a sign put up by the Ku Klux Klan welcoming you to Tuscaloosa. So I begin these pieces. This is not an actual Klansman. This is a G.I. Joe dressed as a Klansman. And then I began to photograph them in unusual settings, and so you don't really know what you're looking at. A large drawing. There are over 100 drawings in the tableau. This is based on an experience, a first-hand experience I had with the Klan in 1962 in Alabama when I read about a Klan rally down at the Tuscaloosa County Courthouse. I said to a friend who happened to be Jewish, that enters into the story, I said, Ed, let's go down and see what this is like. Just 2 curious young men. So we get down there, and there's no evidence of any Klan activity in this old white marble courthouse. And I said, let's go inside. He said, no, I'm Jewish. I'm not going to go inside with you. So I started up these old stairs and didn't see anything. The lights were blaring. I got to the second level, nothing. I got to the top step of the third level, and here within arm's reach was a Klansman in full robes and hood. And he did not turn and look at me. He was a sentry. He kept his position, but he looked to the right with his eyes, and I will forever remember. I have never seen anything so scary. I ran out of the building. That was the first time I'd ever seen an actual Klansman. So this drawing is based on that experience. And then the idea of dressing G.I. Joe, that's a long story. And in the tableau, there are way over 100 G.I. Joe dolls dressed as Klansmen. And in more recent years, thanks to a wonderful residency at the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I made some more dolls that are more brutal, sticking pins in them, pouring hot wax on them, etc., etc. Let me just say one more time, that is a body of work that has to be seen as a body of work. To see it fragmented doesn't work, and it's very risky. But I just don't feel I could speak with you or speak to you tonight without at least making some reference to it. And then in 1979, here in Washington, my studio was at Connecticut, near Calvert Street, 2625 Connecticut, right not far from the Shoreham and that very nice section. Someone broke into my studio and stole the Klan tableau. They locked the door back up. There was no evidence of vandalism. The strangest, the most terrifying thing I've ever had happen or expect to happen. The effect of that theft on my wife and children, it's difficult to talk about. And my wife does not like for me to talk about it anytime, any place, because we do not know if it was pro-Klan, anti-Bill Christenberry, or what. But it was taken just as neat as a pin, as if you came into your library or study after sleeping the night and your books were gone, but nothing was strewn about, nothing was destroyed, and in this case, the door locked back up. There are many, 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 many thoughts and who could have done this, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe it was the Klan because I think the Klan would like for me to know they did it. What scares me the most is that it's probably somebody I know that I still may have contact with. I dreamed immediately after the theft that I was on a backcountry road in Alabama. I came around a curve in that road, and here was this building with no windows and no doors, with an unbelievably pitched roof. And it was covered with these outdoor advertising signs that I like, I love, I covet, I steal, I borrow, appropriate, that's the word. And so I said to myself the next morning, I said if Jasper Johns, an artist I respect very much, and a fellow Southerner, if he could dream that he painted an American flag, and that's where he got the idea, and do it, I'm going to make my dream building. So what you see here is dream building Roman numeral 1. Since then, I have now made over 30 dream buildings, pieces based on that dream. This is about 19 inches high and 12 inches square at the bottom. A more recent one where there's actually a gourd tree attached. And another piece that's made up of 11 of these white encaustic covered dream buildings. It's called Dream Building Ensemble, and it too will be in the exhibition here in Washington. Some of those are 10 feet high. And even more recently, one that's about 7 feet high that's now, I'm pleased to say, in the collection of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. And a little surprise to many of you, work that's not been seen, only recently photographed in the studio that will be in the exhibition that we'll have here in Washington. You can't tell too much in this light, but those bars there are all heavy steel, heavy metal, another dream building. A little grouping, little wall, 8 dream buildings on shelves. It will be a wall piece. Back to the memory form with coffin, a little pine coffin in that space. Another memory form. I have no idea where this piece comes from or what it means, but that's a gourd, that green object up there. I haven't even come up with a title for this piece, but when my aunt's sister was still alive in that little town called Greensboro, she had this gourd in her kitchen. And years ago, when they raised chickens and had eggs, they would go out to the hen house and bring eggs back and put it in this object. And I just thought, and they painted it green. I just have always thought it was such an evocative form. Strange to me, but evocative. So you'll see that next summer. And a new piece called Patchwork House on stilts. Multicolored wood over a wooden frame. That's about 6 feet high. And this is one of my, well, I'll just say my favorite thing that I most enjoy doing, that's closest to my heart, is drawing. And I love trying to teach drawing. So this is a drawing of a tree I did in 1958 when I was still in Alabama, actually before I entered graduate school that one year. I went out in front of the library on the beautiful University of Alabama campus with my graphite pencil and sketch pad and made this drawing as pretty literal, pretty representational, if you want to say. I didn't realize that years later how important it was to me then and now. So here are some new drawings in recent years, and they're called Southern Trees, and the drawings are usually, in this case, a beautiful German ink, and these are large. This is on 32 by 40 inch 2-ply mat board. The gourds strung up. Some people see them as ominous and threatening. So be it. And one on a blue ground. And then about 2 years ago, I got a call from the museum director and curator at the Birmingham, Alabama Museum, which is a beautiful, large museum. We do wear shoes down there, and some of us speak the language, or some other, maybe I don't, but some people speak the language, saying they'd like to talk about commissioning a piece from me. Now remember, Birmingham, oftentimes during the civil rights movement referred to as Bombingham, because of the terrible, terrible things that went on there. Unbelievable. And I just felt so pleased that they were interested in something like this, and I explained to them. They flew me down, and I met with them, and we talked endlessly, although they had their mind made up. They wanted a dream building. I said, do you understand? I guess I used the word symbol or symbolism in these pieces. A lot of it references the Klan, the hooded head. We want a dream building. So I made this piece that's 15 feet high. It has the gourds. It has the gourd tree leaning up against it. The only requirement they made that it be on a field of Alabama red earth. And it's in a beautiful new building right down the street from the museum. The only thing in the lobby space. And here it's difficult to see, but that gives you some idea of the space it's in. And, excuse me, I'm real pleased about this because it's my home state. They understand the subject matter. This is what they wanted. Pardon that bit of ego. A very recent piece that will be at the Smithsonian, American Art Museum, called Strange Fruit in memory of Billie Holiday. And I think you have to see it, and hopefully when you see it, you get some feeling of what this is about. And last but not least, you remember the church I showed you early on, Sprott Church. 1974 is when I made that piece. All these years later, I come back to the form, and I build this piece pretty much to the same proportions as the original one. And again, it's covered with white wax, and it's on a field of red earth and Alabama black earth. It was recently purchased by a wonderful foundation in Hanover, Germany. But I have not a repeat, not a replica, but a new piece that's going to remain private that will make its debut at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, July the 4th, 2006. Thank you very much. There is some talk, if you like. I'll entertain favorable comments or be nailed to the wall here. Anybody have any questions or comments? We have a few minutes, I'm told. Yes, ma'am. Way back there, sir. I can't see in the lights. Well, it's just replicating or faking that red brick, or the ochre brick for that matter, because that was done on a paper, and I would make it to scale, the paper, the size, reproduced brick, and I had to put in my paint, which was acrylic, I had to put some real fine sand, because you know how brick has that rough surface. And I wanted that to be visible, and if you touched it, you would feel that. So I would paint it with the sand and the red paint. And then how am I going to draw those brick? So I went around to then People's Drug, now CVS, and I bought a bunch of little marking pens. And every time I would do a line, it would wear the pen out because of the grit and the sand. I have to be out of my skull to have done that, but that was a really time-consuming, laborious task to make that, because it was a surface, the surface that you could respond to visually, even though you might not be able to touch it. But I'm not going to do many more pieces like that because it's too big a job. Yes, please. It's a very good question. It's a legitimate question. It's not easy for me to talk about. I'll try in the sense of space, isolation in space, where these buildings are, trying to evoke not nostalgia, but this deep, profound feeling for a little structure that was once there and is now gone, It is probably true. I had the good fortune, Betsy Bruin mentioned this in the introduction, to know the great photographer Walker Evans, who encouraged me. He was the first person to see the little brownie snapshots. When I left Alabama in 60 and went to New York, and our friendship grew. It was A.G. that I wanted to know about, because A.G. was a fellow Southerner. He was from Knoxville, Tennessee, but he died too young, A.G. did. But nevertheless, Walker Evans, that stance in many of his pictures of severe frontality and et cetera, et cetera. I've never denied, I have no reason to deny Mr. Evans' great influence in so many ways. But I'll never forget that night when he and his wife came down. They had been so nice to me to invite me up to dinner. I think they saw something in this corn pone kid that was worth watching over, you know, away from home for the first time. And he wanted to see my paintings, because Walker loved paintings. One of his best friends was Ben Shawn, who was a good photographer and a great artist. And remind me to tell you, if we have time, a quick story about Shawn and Evans. But Walker wanted to see the paintings because he loved painting. He did painting himself, and I had absolutely no reservation about showing him the paintings. I was flattered. And I had those monster paintings rolled on rug tubes, you know, that I brought all the way from Alabama. And he was just so excited about the paintings. And then he said to me on a second visit, he said, "Young man, you mentioned you made color snapshots in reference to these paintings." I said, "Yes, sir. Sometimes they were taking off places, the snapshots. I'd like to see those." I put him off. I didn't want to show him those things. I was scared. They were nothing but snapshots, as I said, processed at the local drugstore. But he was persistent. So one night he and Mrs. Evans were there, and I brought out the box of these original drugstore prints. And he just distanced himself from the conversation, and Mrs. Evans, Isabel, and I were over in the corner of the room talking about something else. I didn't think he'd ever finish. And in a little while he finished, and he looked up and he said, "Young man, there's something about the way you use that little camera. It's become a perfect extension of your eye, and I suggest you take them seriously." Well, coming from Walker Evans, even then, was pretty special, but I got a hard head. It didn't sink in. It didn't sink in. I wasn't interested in photography. I will say this, in many ways, in the various things that I try to do as an artist, there's no more honest statement than those little snapshots. And then, gosh, there's a rather large show of those in the early 70s at the Corcoran. And then I started getting phone calls from primarily New York and elsewhere. And I've known Bill Eggleston since my days in Memphis, a close, close friend. And then one day I got this call from Lee Friedlander, some of you know, who just had the wonderful big exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And then our friendship began to grow. But it was a lot of that was based on these little drugstore processed pictures. And I've never, it's difficult for me to find that film for those cameras anymore. Why? Because we have all these digital things. I'm not bright enough to go digital. But I can still find that film. You used to walk into any country store and find 127 film. Did I answer your question, or did I avoid it? I tried. Yes, sir. Or some. Well, I taught first as a graduate assistant. First, I never thought I could get up before a group of people and say anything. I was so shy. Now some people, especially my wife, think I talk too much, but I do like to tell a story. I like stories. And while we're on that note, this museum in Cologne, we're working on a book of my stories. Not lies, but some of which I told tonight, and the one-armed man. there will be accompanying, not illustrations, an accompanying photograph or accompanying sculpture or drawing of the books that I've been fortunate to have printed on my work. That's the one I most look forward to. And the museum director came, and she just had the tape recorder going, and it's got to be natural. I cannot write them. They're just like that when I try to write them. But I've always loved a good story, and I like to try to tell a good story. Is that a hand back there? No. Gosh, you've been patient. I got 500 more slides here we could show. Yes?
Let's invite everybody downstairs for a reception.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.